April 8th, Sunday. At 3 p.m, Ewing came back from HQ in a great flurry, gave me a map and pointed out a crossroads 3 kilometers in front of Epernay. He said that on the next evening we were to carry wire to that point in preparation for an attack, and now I was to take 2 NCOs to reconnoitre it. At 4 p.m, with Corporals Mackay and Wood, I took a nice little walk up to Epernay. There was very little shelling, and as the ground was new to us, we found it rather interesting. The village was very badly smashed, and we did not see a single living person, though there were several dead Jerrys and English. We passed straight on to the station, then followed the railway to the right past a ruined cemetery, until we came to a patch of ground pitted with hundreds of shell holes. We judged this to be the commencement of our road, and stopped to verify it. As we decided that it was, the German guns opened and a dozen field shells fell around us, covering us with earth and enveloping us in a fog of fumes as we cowered in a shell hole. During a lull, we jumped up and ran forward onto the hard road ahead, which led on across the green slopes. In a few minutes, the clouds, which had been closing in as we advanced, opened to drench us with rain. This provoked a flow of choice language from the NCOs, who had all this time kept up a continuous crosstalk of chaff and commentary. I had grown to like these fellows immensely, and was now on very good terms with them. On we plodded, while the mist and darkness closed in, and we got thoroughly soaked and fed up, until at last we topped the ridge, and before us saw a line of glistening earth hitting our road at right angles. "There you are," I said. "That is the road junction, and will be the dump tomorrow night." Wood's sharp eyes detected a belt of wire on our side of the road, and as it was not marked on my map, we went forward another 50 yards to make sure. We were now about 70 yards from it and could see it clearly, so I jotted it on my map, and we made our way back with a better grace than we had left as we advanced. It was pitch dark when we reached Epernay, and following the railway, we had stopped to examine an enormous mine crater on the line, when I was astounded to hear Ewing's voice at a short distance away. I was so pleased with myself for having carried out a job successfully that I at once shouted and went after him. Inside the commencement of a deep cutting, I found the whole company assembled, and on inquiry learnt that they had moved up during my absence and relieved the 6th Battalion. Ewing was the picture of childish rage. He was stamping, tearing his hair and almost crying. As soon as I approached, he turned on me, screaming, "Where's my telephone, you damned slacker? What's the good of sending you on a job? I sent you up to take over the positions, and now I've no information and no HQ. If Kentish had come, he'd never let me down," etc. I tried hard to get a word in, but he ramped on like a madman, so I left him saying I would talk to him when he was in his senses and when there were no NCOs present. I found Billy Kentish a little further on, sitting on a heap of mud and looking a horrid mess. He had returned from his short leave in Amiens and was too fed up to sympathise with me. In fact, he rather sided with Ewing. I helped them to fix the company up in little cubbyholes dug into the embankment, posted sentries along the top, and finally found a little shaft leading about 6 feet into the side of the bank, where I left Dunham guarding my pack while I went to find Ewing, intending to have it out. Returned with him, and with a lighted candle stuck into the earth, we sat down. The dignity of both of us was handicapped at the offset by the fact that we had to sit one at each end of a short board balanced on a bucket, and I could not forget for a moment the ludicrous effect that I would produce if I suddenly stood up and sent my irate company commander sprawling on his back. I asked him to explain his remarks about my letting him down, and at once he assumed his blustering attack. He affirmed that he had instructed me to come up and take over these positions from the 6th Warwicks, ready to lead the company in when they arrived. I was simply astounded by his cool prevarication, but I quietly handed him my map and asked him to mark on it the enemy front line. After some hesitation, he did so, and his line corresponded with the line of wire that I had marked in. Then I pointed out the circle he had made round the crossroads when he told me that that was to be our dump, and I told him in hard, cold tones, still precariously balanced on the bucket, that we had actually walked in daylight onto the enemy lines, and that only the mist and the slope of the ground behind us, and the idiotic nature of our errand, had prevented us from being shot to ribbons or, at the best, taken prisoners. I didn't rub it in too much, for he half admitted that he had been overwhelmed by the responsibility of taking a company up for the first time, and he looked so miserable that I considered it more blessed to forgive, and producing my flask, I gave him a swig of whisky. A few minutes later, an officer of the Royal Engineers came along and claimed the dugout as his built by his own servant. So out we turned into the cheerless cutting, and having nowhere else to go, we left Kentish on duty and climbed up the embankment at the back to find the HQ of A Company, who were in support a few hundred yards behind. We found them in a tiny corrugated iron shanty, where we joined them in a drink. It was fairly cosy, but I was terribly windy all the time I was there. Perhaps it was because the shelter looked so lonely, right out in the middle of a field, or possibly because one side was riddled with bullet holes. Anyway, I was heartily glad to get back again to the cutting, where 20 feet below earth level I felt safe. April 9th. At midnight I went on duty, and as it was quite impossible for us to stay out in the open, with no HQ, we decided to establish one in the village behind, and remain one at a time on duty in the cutting. So Ewing and Kentish set off across the fields, while I proceeded to make myself thoroughly acquainted with our position. This was not difficult, for the company was simply huddled in a line along the front bank. At our right the cutting ended at the vast mine crater, and our left flank rested on a bridge which had been blown up, and so blocked the rails. Along the top of the bank, fire steps had been cut at intervals, and on each a sentry was posted. Sergeant Major Chalk and 1 or 2 sergeants had fixed themselves a bivouac with their oil sheets, and with a brazier glowing inside they were quite happy. Sergeant Alsop had found a huge barrel in which he sat smoking and cross-legged like a goblin. The remainder of the troops had only such shelter from the rain and cold as their oil sheets provided. I sent Dunham back to the village to locate HQ, and waited at the demolished bridge until 4 a.m. when he returned with Kentish, who relieved me. Returning to the village with Dunham, I found a house almost undamaged and of gloomy aspect from without. But entering under the oil sheets, I found myself in a cheerily lit kitchen wherein the servants were sitting by a roaring fire. In another room, amongst his satellites, sat Sergeant Major Chalk, who had abandoned the bivvy in the cutting. Descending the cellar steps, I entered a cosy scene. It had been occupied by the Boche, and along one side were 2 wire beds on which Ewing and Johnny Teague lay asleep, and in a recess at the far end my valise and Billy's lay side by side. There were 2 big armchairs, a settee, and a round table on which a lamp burnt, and my supper was laid. I dropped into a chair and removed my sodden boots, puttees and tunic, then made a hearty meal of pontoon which Martin brought me. He also brought in a small glowing brazier, and I sat beside this with a cigarette and a large hot rum, feeling luxuriously lazy and revelling in the thought that I had 3 whole hours, to eat or sleep or read, before I must go out again into the rain and cold, to sludge about looking at tired and dirty troops trying to be cheerful. I even read a chapter of some sloppy book belonging to Teague before I finally crawled into my valise. At 8 a.m. I was back in the line. It was quite light, so I could not go across the open. Running past our billet was a road, slightly sunken, which led to the cutting, and I followed this. At its commencement stood a life-size crucifix. At 11 a.m., when we were getting nicely comfortable, the rain having stopped, there was a mighty crash as a 5.9 fell smack into the cutting. 1 or 2 bivvies were hit by shrapnel, but no one was hurt. I was off duty from 12 to 4 p.m. At 5 p.m. I was feeling bored, so I went up into an artillery observation post and spent an hour with the forward observation officer. It is his duty to observe and direct the fire of his battery by telephonic reports. On this occasion he was very successful, getting 2 direct hits on the beet factory. We watched the heavies registering on Villers-Guislain and saw and heard explosions both there and in Honnecourt, followed by terrific fires as if we had hit their dumps. The German kite balloons kept ascending and descending rapidly. Probably they were trying to spot our guns. Through our glasses we saw quite a number of men moving about, particularly in front of Canal Wood. The forward observation post got shrapnel onto them and got most of them running, But one man stood still, and after each burst signalled an ironical washout with his arms. During the night he peppered us very sharply with whiz-bangs and 5.9s. But fortunately we had pushed our posts forward down the slope, so that most of the men were away from the cutting when the shells came. I stood on the top of the embankment during the shelling and took bearings with my compass. I spotted 3 distinct batteries, April 10th. The firing slackened from 3 a.m. to 5 a.m., but then, just as it was getting light, about 20 5.9s came in a steady stream, catching the cutting with deadly precision. They were so horribly accurate that after the first 1 or 2 I took to my heels and ran forward to the troops in the advanced posts, leaving them to crash and pound into the empty cutting. I waited until the shelling had stopped before I sent the troops back, and I must have let it get too light, for as I withdrew the last post and stood on the embankment watching them climb down, a crackle of bullets swept past me, some beside, some over my head. I dropped like a rabbit and rolled down the bank, grabbed a Lewis gun and climbed up again in time to see about a dozen Boche hurrying across to the left, 1,000 yards in front. I gave them a couple of bursts and had the satisfaction of seeing several drop, while the remainder ran on and got into a trench. I returned the gun to its owner and then started off for HQ with Dunham. I was too tired to go round by the road and decided to risk it across the top. We walked quite leisurely, expecting a burst of fire at any moment, but there was no sound, and in safety we crossed the shell-pitted fields of Crucifix Corner. Dunham went straight on, but I stood for several minutes gazing around me. The undulating slopes were beautifully green, save where concentrated shelling had left a brown burn. The sun had risen and was glowing on the red-patched roofs of Epéhy and Petzieres. Crucifix Corner had been heavily shelled, but now looked delightfully peaceful. The figure was untouched except for a shrapnel hole right through the heart, and 2 robins were singing merrily, one perched on the hand, and one on the crown of thorns. I felt very calm and soulful as I turned away to walk up the road. Instead of going into the billet, I passed it and went along to a little pond, where I sat on the stone coping, looking at the new shell holes of the previous night, drinking in the sweet air of dawn, and once more thinking of a number of things. We were perfectly quiet all day, and I thoroughly enjoyed wandering round with Kentish and Ewing looking at corpses of Jerrys. Shelling recommenced at nightfall and caught our corner pretty heavily. The crucifix came down, smashing the figure to atoms. At midnight we were relieved by the 14th York and Lancs, who were most frightfully windy. They belong to the 42nd Division, who have just returned from Egypt. After relief, we marched back to Longavenna, where at dawn we took over our original billet in the Chicken Run. April 11th. I was wonderfully happy when I woke after a refreshing sleep. In the bright sunshine, our tiny room looked very cheerful. There were 2 beds of wire netting, one above each other. Billy had wanted to toss for beds of wire, but I had flatly refused to sleep with his enormous weight hanging over me, so here I was up top. Then we had a tiny table and 2 boxes for seats. On the walls were saucy pictures from La Vie, and there was no door, so we had plenty of air. It surely was a happy day, for after a late and cheery breakfast, I went out onto the village road and saw Ewing talking to the one man I most wanted to meet again. It was Sid Pepper, who had been with me in England, and whose parting words had been, "Remember, when you get to France, to say, 'I'm for the 1 or 8th, and don't let them put you to any other crush.'" He himself had come to France as a private in the battalion, had got a commission on the 1st of July 1916 during the Somme attack, and had been shot through the stomach. He had nearly died, and I had left him a living skeleton permanent home service. He had never been happy at home, and after much agitating and rejection by medical boards, he had enlisted an eminent surgeon to help him through. When his girl learnt that he had asked to come back to France, she had chucked him, so he let her go, and here he was back with the bat. He was accompanied by a Captain Hoskins. Our meals were very cheery, for we had to sit, 2 on the boxes, 2 on the bed, and 1 on the ground outside. After lunch, Pepper and I went into the cemetery behind and looked at the inscriptions on the gravestones. In the evening we played Slippery Ann. April 12th. We routed the company out and played football near the cemetery before lunch, and in the afternoon a crowd of us turned out with revolvers and potted at bottles. Of course we had money on it, and I was glad to find that my hand was still steady enough to rake in a few francs, though the commanding officer carried off most. They had shifted a battery of 60-pounders close to our billet, which kicked up a frightful din. Also, Jerry's heavy guns had been searching for it, and we had a pretty breezy time. The Roman Catholic padre came in to dinner, and I arranged to clear a billet out for him to say Mass next morning. I also told Sergeant Gunn of 15 Platoon, who was a Roman Catholic, to warn all Catholics. April 13th. After breakfast, I strolled down to the well with Gunn and watched the Royal Engineers trying to clear it and render it workable. Then we went on to number 13 Platoon's cellar, where we found the padre waiting. After clearing out the non-Catholics, we went to confession behind a blanket. Then he said Mass on a bully box covered with an oil sheet, and we went to communion. In the afternoon, Sid Pepper and I took the company up to Basse-Boulogne via Villers-Faucon and Saint-Émilie. The latter village was terribly battered. There had been several large factories which had been mined, so that the whole place had been littered with debris of shattered machinery. We were working on road repairs near Quid Copse, and having set the troops on the job, Sid and I wandered off into the ruined gardens and filled our haversacks with lettuces and other saladable stuff. Returned after a few hours' work. April 14th. We received a nasty setback this morning, in the form of orders to parade immediately and march back to the line where we would relieve 14th York and Lancs. Our troops were infuriated to learn that the 42nd Division had retreated from Guillemont Farm, which our 5th Battalion had captured with heavy losses. Now that division was so windy that we had to relieve them, and at nightfall our division was to advance and recapture the farm, and also Pigeon Ravine. We were to support the 6th Battalion on the latter sector. Approaching Salcourt, we met the 10th Manchesters marching back, and our lads greeted them in no veiled terms. "Make way for the soldiers." "And here come the windy 42nd," were the mildest of their shouts. In daylight we entered the cutting at Épehy, and there were several free fights before the relief was carried out. As soon as it was dusk, we moved out of the cutting to the much-shelled crossroads, whence Woods, Mackay and I had commenced our famous reconnaissance of the Boche line. 2,000 yards up the road we came to the tiny ruin of Red Mill. The shelling here had been terrific, and the ground was a churned mass of holes. Need I say that the rain had started as we left the cutting? From Red Mill we extended to the left in a straight line across the valley, and in the steady rain, in long wet grass, we lay for 2 hours before anything happened. Then the German shells began to fall, scattered at first along our line, then more and more heavily, particularly about the mill where I lay with Sergeant Hughes. They were dead on our line, but luckily no one was hit, chiefly owing to the fact that the ground was so soft that they sank well in before bursting. Then out from the darkness behind grunted a line of dumpy figures, overcoated with fixed bayonets, weighed down by their soaked clothing and loads of spades, sandbags and bombs. They passed through us like a comb, only an occasional greeting to an acquaintance breaking the silence. Then, 2 minutes later, a second line passed through into the rain and darkness, and we were left, with high explosive bursts around us, to wait with bated breath for sounds of the attack. A quarter of an hour of silence. The shelling had ceased, and we heard nothing but the swish of rain, when suddenly there was a sharp flash and crash of a bursting bomb, a dozen rifle shots, and then the air was thick with bullets as angry machine guns spat fire along our line. The darkness was cut by the flashes of rifles and bombs. Then from behind came the flames of German guns, as a barrage was opened that sent hundreds of shells crashing amongst us and caused us to bury our faces in the mud and pray for respite. In a few minutes, 2 figures staggered back, one with his arm gone, the other shot in the side. One collapsed and died, the other we patched up and sent back. After that, wounded and unwounded came running, walking, crawling back, all in utter despair. The show had been a ghastly failure, for the Boche had vacated their trench, and from positions on the high ground behind had mown down our lads with bombs and machine guns as they floundered about in the wire. Along came the order to advance, and with beating hearts we fixed bayonets and moved forward in a heavy black line, so like the lads who now lay dead in our path. But the gods were good to us. For suddenly the machine guns stopped, the barrage lifted and unmolested. We reached the belt of wire behind which the remnants of the 6th Battalion were digging frantically to prepare the trench for the counterattack that must follow as surely as night follows day. We leapt in and worked beside them, shifting sandbags and converting the parados into a parapet. April 15th, Sunday. At 1 o'clock, as we waited for the first signs of a Boche counterattack, we heard troops behind us, and learnt with delirious joy that it was the 10th Lanks who had been sent up to relieve us. Eagerly we handed over and made off down the ravine to the cutting. As I passed through the wire, I stopped to free a poor dying bugler boy who had been caught and shot through the throat. I handed him over to the stretcher-bearers who were now busy amongst the wounded, who lay shrieking and groaning on all sides. We moved straight back to Longavna, where we learnt, before turning in, that the 5th had regained Gillencourt Farm with many casualties. It was estimated that there were 700 dead lying around the building. We did not have much rest, for at 11 a.m. Sid Pepper and I again assumed the role of Stonecracker John and led the company up to Basse Boulogne for road mending. When we had seen the troops started, we took the servants along into the village. At the crossroads we found a small portion of kitchen standing, and here we dumped our haversacks, and the servants with instructions to have a sumptuous repast at 1 o'clock. Forgetting all we had learnt about advanced guards and scouting, we marched back to the troops and butted into General Fanshawe, haranguing a group of our NCOs. At once he sent them away and commenced to devour us, as a more worthy prey. He was annoyed by a group of men who were walking about in the open near Quid Copse. Secure in his sense of innocence and righteousness, Pepper thought he could afford to be saucy. "Those men, sir," he said, "are Royal Engineers. We are the Royal Warwicks." This lashed Fanny into a state of fury. "Oh, but I thought you were an officer. What's this? It looks to me like a Sam Brown belt. It's time you realised that you fellows are not in charge of platoons or companies. You are responsible for the whole army. They may be engineers, but if they draw shelling, the Warwicks will get it as well." And some more. We saluted, sent an NCO to drive away the offending Royal Engineers, and knocked the company off for lunch. Returning to the crossroads, we found a dixie of tea awaiting us, and we attacked our sandwiches with appetites sharpened by the keen air. Crash! Up went a 5.9 outside, and a bit more of our kitchen fell in. 5 more crashes flung mud and stones over us and into our tea, then all was quiet. Then shaken nerves and foul language were the record of the Royal Engineers exhibition on the hill. I bet Fanny laughed if he saw them fall. We finished lunch and a cigarette cup, then whistled the company together for the afternoon's work. At 3 p.m. a short, stout figure puffed up to Pepper and greeted him heartily. It was Major Townsend, with whom Holland used to disappear for his drinking bouts. We walked a little way with him, across to an old ruined sugar factory behind the road. There was nothing left of the building, and in a huge, green, slimy pool were piled bodies of men and horses in a ghastly, putrefying swamp. The stench was horrible, and we soon beat it back to the road, meeting a dozen high-velocity shells en route, one of which burst a few yards from Pepper as he lay grovelling in the mud. Just after 4 p.m. we marched back to Longavernus, the troops heavily laden with salad and vegetables which they had scrounged. I don't think they had carried out a lot of work. April 16th. A new officer named Kinnell had joined us, and he accompanied me with the company to Villers-Faucon, where we were to erect Adrian huts. A mine had exploded here 2 days before in a house used as the HQ of the 4th Gloucesters. The commanding officer, adjutant, second-in-command, padre, doctor, and all the staff were killed. The 7th Battalion were now in the village, so I went in to see the padre. The red-haired one had gone, and Farr Woodlock, a Jesuit, had taken his place. He was living with Jones, their QM, and I soon got very chummy with him. We strolled along to the church, where we climbed the tower, which gave us a very good view of the surrounding country. It was interesting to watch the batteries working below us. Descending again, we found the skeleton of a kiddie about 8 years old, blown out of a grave. The dear little smooth white skull was lying near the church steps, and we picked it up and laid it with the other bones in the opened grave. Then we covered it in and gently patted the earth back. The padre grunted when I told her to go to sleep again, but it pleased me to think that she was a little golden-haired lassie and that she looked down shyly to say, "Merci, soldats." For Woodlock is the brother of Mother Regis at Ilford, and he was in great distress because of a letter in the recorder about children not going home sharp from school or something. It really is a terrible war. April 17th. The company was detailed to go up to Pigeon Ravine this morning to erect barbed wire. Ewing marched off 3 platoons, but I was left behind with number 13 cleaning Lewis guns. I had instructions to follow them when our job was done, and at 1 p.m. I moved up. I was very surprised to meet Kinnell on the road coming back on a stretcher. He told me that the Boche had spotted them working and opened up with shrapnel. There had been several casualties, and he had touched for one on the foot. At the Epernay crossroads, we found a huge cat squatting on the chest of a dead German, eating his face. It made us sick to see it, and I sent 2 men to chase it away. As they approached, it sprang snarling at them, but they beat it down with their rifles and drove it into the ruined houses. Then we covered the body with a sack and went on. Up the old Red Mill Road we found the bodies of the 6th Battalion lying as they had fallen, and ahead in the ravine we saw a line of shell bursts flowering and fading in quick succession. This rather put the wind up us, and we were heartily relieved as we approached to see Ewing sending his men back towards us at the double. He had found it impossible to work under the heavy shelling, so we marched back. At Epernay we saw the sack we had thrown over the dead Jerry heaving up and down, and there was Pretty Pussy, still rending and tearing the body, so we shot it and continued our march to Longavenay. We had hardly taken off our equipment when we received orders to pack up again and return to Pigeon Ravine, there to relieve the 14th York and Lancs in the line. This we carried out at dusk, and we found ourselves occupying a line of detached posts across the valley, where we had lain out during the attack. During the night, the darkness was so intense that we had to arrange a code of whistle signals to guide us from one post to another. Company HQ was simply an isolated pit in the wilderness, which during the long black night we could only locate by a faint glimmer of light which Sergeant Major Chalk showed on the signal of a code whistle. April 18th. I established myself in a little trench with Sergeant Swingler, making myself a seat by scooping a hole in the earth wall. In my tiny cubbyhole I spent the afternoon writing a letter, with the water pouring off the oil sheet, which I had fastened over my head, onto my legs which stuck out below, and a candle burning on a bit of stick jabbed into the earth 6 inches from my nose. We arranged the same signals as the night was again dark and wet, but at midnight the 1 and 4 ox and bucks came up and relieved us. We were filled with delirious joy to learn that we were going right back to Péronne, but unfortunately I had to remain in Épernay to guide in a new detachment of the 42nd Division. So I brought my platoon into the courtyard near Crucifix Corner, then made myself comfortable in the old cellar which had been our HQ. April 19th. When the 42nd turned up, we showed them round the positions and then turned in for a little sleep before moving off. I had intended to march off at 8 a.m., but the new arrivals seemed windy and loath to let us go, so that by the time we had answered all their questions it was 11 a.m. We marched to Salcourt, where we had lunch in the soup kitchen, and were just going on again when I remembered that I had left my leather cigarette case, a present from Mother, in the dugout at Épernay. I mentioned it to Dunham, and like a brick he trudged off back for it without a murmur. I went on with the platoon, and had just settled down to a long, weary footslog when we were overtaken by a lorry. The driver not only consented willingly to give us a lift to Péronne, but took us back to pick up Dunham, who had retrieved my case and was legging it like blazes to overtake us. Then we were borne back towards the rear, singing merrily. On the way, my blackthorn, which I had brought out from England, fell out at the back, and we were travelling so fast that we were far away before I could stop the driver, and I had to let it go. At Péronne, which we hailed with ringing cheers, we debarked in the market square, which was hardly recognisable in its present state. All rubbish had been cleared from the roads, the shell holes were filled up, and the cobbles replaced. CQMS Caulfield met us and directed me to our billet. This was down a side road near the corner which I had last seen in flames. Here, close to the river, was a house practically untouched, in which I saw Ewing and Hoskins. The platoon's billet was practically next door. I took them in, saw them wash their feet and settle down, then went into our HQ. At the door I passed and saluted Colonel Hanson, but he did not recognize me on account of my scraggy ginger beard. Kentish was sitting in an armchair looking awfully seedy, and they told me that the doctor had ordered him to hospital with quinsy. He left an hour later. The mess was ripping. The room I was in had been a shop. Now it contained a settee, one arm and 4 other chairs and 2 tables. Behind it was a large kitchen with a big open fireplace, and then another room full of rubbish. On the first floor were 3 rooms, and on the second, 2 more. During the afternoon, a new batch of officers arrived, of whom the following were posted to D Company. Jimmy Harding, an oldish fellow, dry and wizened, late champion shot of southern India, who we forthwith nicknamed the Rajah. Frank Radcliffe, an artistic, quiet, middle-aged man and a doctor of music, and then a very young chap named Hammond, an ex-grenadier guardsman of splendid stature and physique. All were excellent fellows, and in half an hour we were a very cheery crowd. We split up bedrooms, sleeping in pairs, Hammond and I, Radcliffe and Harding, Pepper and Ewing. The servants took the top floor rooms. Our first dinner was a very jolly meal. Hammond and I went round to the canteen and returned laden with delicacies, curried prawns, tinned fruit and butter, tongue, port and liqueurs, etc. I exerted myself as mess president, and when we had had delightful baths, shaves and changes of clothing, we sat down to a 6-course dinner that prepared us for a long sociable evening round the fire, with glasses of port beside us and Coronas between our lips. When we went to bed, I had a long talk with Hammond, who told me all about his home life, his fiancée who seemed very, very dear to him, and then he astounded me by saying that they knew that they could never marry, in fact that he had not long to live, for he was eaten up with consumption. April 20th. We sallied forth in a body after breakfast to make a tour of the town. We followed the river along towards the centre of the town and came to a large prisoner-of-war camp, there to a couple of big marquees, which were the YMCA and the EFC. Here we turned up the street in which I had spent my first night in Péronne. Here, by the way, the Royal Engineers were erecting a new bridge to cross the river to the station the Huns had blown the old one down. We went up into the square and examined several cellars, ending up at the Citadel, an enormous medieval fortress, where the walls of 20-foot thickness were chipped and scarred by shell bursts. The 5th Battalion were billeted in one part of the castle, and all the remaining rooms were empty, except that in a tiny attic at the top we found an ancient arquebus. We dared Jimmy Harding to take this on parade, but he solemnly assured us that when he joined the army first, he used to use one. The vast moat had been converted into a rifle range, and as we went out into it, I met and exchanged a few words with Sergeant Foster of the 5th, whom I had last seen in England. We returned to the billet, had lunch, and then I went out into the garden behind. Here the rubbish lay waist-deep. There were thousands of tins which had been thrown out by the Boche. Nearly all had American labels Libby's milk, corned beef, pork and beans, etc., and there were large piles of old clothing and of decaying vegetation. I resolved to clear this up and make a pleasant garden in which we could sit during our off-hours. So I started at once with a long German mud shovel to hurl the tins over into the neighbouring garden, and lighting a big fire with paper and broken furniture, I piled up clothing and rubbish, which it consumed rapidly. It became rather lively after a bit, for amongst the muck were lots of bullets which exploded and made me skip. One hit a window of the billet and put the wind up the servants. At the end of 4 hours I had made very little impression, so after tea I went out again and worked until dark, by which time I had reached ground level on an area of about 4 or 5 square yards. April 21st. The company was sent out for a rather pleasant job today. We marched to the station where we filled lorries with stones, hopped on them and rode to a little village called Courcelles, just past Doint, where we shovelled the stones out into piles by the roadside and returned for more loads. It was a beautifully bright, fresh day, so we thoroughly enjoyed it. Returned at 4 p.m. for tea, after which Radcliffe and I went round scrounging. We went through dozens of houses, climbing over roofs and knocking through walls, and ended up with lots of nice cutlery, salt cellars, glasses, etc. Our wallpaper was badly faded, so from another house I peeled the whole side and repapered our mess. We scrounged curtains for our glassless windows and some lamps and tablecloths, so that by evening, with our Harrison Fisher girls framed upon the walls, we had a very cosy mess. April 22nd, Sunday. There was no work today, and as the Padre was away, no mass, so I put in a lot of time in the garden. For a while we amused ourselves by shooting at bottles, until there came a loud howling from the platoon's billet. We dashed in to see who had been hit and found all the troops grinning. Someone had been fooling us, but we couldn't find out who it was. April 23rd. We learnt that we were going to stay in Peronne for some time, so I thought it would be a good opportunity to have my teeth seen to, as they had been troubling me for some time. Ewing gave me permission to go sick, and having worked with the troops from 7 until 11 a.m., I went up to see Carroll. He told me that the only way for me to get dental treatment was to go to hospital. I told him I wouldn't do that, and returned to the working party, which knocked off at 1 p.m. As we were having lunch, I received a note ordering me to report to HQ at 2:30. Colonel Hanson was away somewhere and Major Gell was acting commanding officer. I found him in the mess with the doctor, the Padre and the assistant adjutant, Mortimer. Without any preliminaries, he charged me with being absent from parade. He said he had visited the working party when I was away, and no one had known where I was. He would not allow me to explain, and said it was another example of my damned slackness. He added, "Look at your record since you have been with the battalion. You fall foul of brigade the first time you report to them. You make a fool of yourself when you take a few men to hand over a position. You lose yourself when you are sent up to find your company HQ, and now you slink away from your work. Now you take my word for it, Vaughan. These things are all marked against you, and remember that if the day ever comes when a company commander is needed, I will see that you are passed over. And moreover, if you don't pull yourself together with a jerk, you will be sent back to England as an inefficient officer." I was covered with shame and indignation at the injustice of his remarks, and at the sneering regards of the Padre, who was a swine, the doctor, who was a blackguard, and the sympathy of Mortimer, who was a damned decent fellow. There was nothing I could say, so I saluted and walked slowly back to the billet, trying to fight down my angry resentment and depression. This was soon accomplished, but by the other fellows who must, I think, have known why I had been called to HQ. They kept up a cheery flow of conversation, and dared me to go out onto the marshes with Hammond in an old punt. So off we went and punted about for an hour, until it filled with water, and we had to scramble back through the mud. After dinner, Pepper, Hammond, Harding and I went out to the nearby lock gates, where we played like kids. Then we played pontoon, until bedtime. April 24th. Was delighted today to be sent back with Pepper to salvage the old trenches at Biaches. I had been longing to have a look round our old positions from the enemy side, and quite excitedly set off with the company in single file along a rustic pile bridge which the Jerrys had constructed across the 500 yards of marsh to La Maisonnette. Here we were met by a salvage corps officer, who set us first to move a light railway trolley across a wide open space to a little wood. This was a long and irksome job, as we had only 3 pieces of rail which we had to lay in succession before the truck as we advanced. When we had finished, we went on to Biaches, where we had had such a rotten time in the line. The main road had been cleared and the shell holes filled in, but otherwise it was untouched. The German trenches were in perfect condition, deep and beautifully revetted with high fire steps and pumps. It was a higher site than ours, and from their observation posts, every bit of our line was visible. We could also see that they had pumped all the water from their trenches down into ours. Then we went down into our lines, and I at once made for our old cellar. But it was blown in. I got up on top and had a look at the graves of our boys, at the ruined boiler house in front, and at the pump between the trenches which both we and the Germans had used. I found that at one point we had each had a machine gun staring straight at each other with only 20 yards between. At the point where I had heard the Boche talking, I saw that we had been standing against the wall of a cellar in which they were living. All the time I had been wandering about, the troops had been collecting and classifying bombs and other objects. Now Pepper's whistle sounded as a signal to knock off for lunch, so we returned to the bomb dump where, sitting on two huge Dud-minis, we ate our sandwiches and played with various French and English bombs. We had just lit our after-lunch pipes when two figures came towards us from the Maisonette Wood. I recognized Padre Woodlock, and the other seemed familiar. As I went to meet them, I saw it was Mr. Jones, my old form master, now a major and senior chaplain in the 42nd Division. We were awfully pleased to meet again and swapped news items about two old boys of Stamford Hill, but unfortunately he had to get back to his division and could only stay a little while. Pepper and I spent the afternoon wandering about Numberman's Land, where we found scores of corpses in the last stages of corruption. They were mostly Frenchmen who had been killed during their attack in September 1916. The German wire was very thick, and in many places he had arranged elaborate bomb traps to catch raiding parties. I had a look at one old shelter behind Desiree, and saw that the one from which Dunham had got ice for our tea was full of green water in which lay a rotting Frenchman. Yet our tea had tasted quite good. April 25th. I did a lot more work in the garden. The fire had been burning continuously and had consumed a vast quantity of rubbish. By the time I knocked off, I had a large space quite clear and had struck a nice tiled path and flower bed with rose shoots still growing. April 26th. In the early morning, Radcliffe and I took the company up past Doint to the place where we had been unloading stones and started to fill up the shell holes. It was 8 a.m. and bitterly cold, so, leaving them hard at it, we went across to some small huts we saw over the fields. There were some transport lines and only a few men asleep, but we found a canteen where we roused a corporal ugly, frowsy and surly, who informed us that he had no tea, no coffee and no cocoa. Bitterly disappointed, we bought a large stock of chocolate for the troops and came away. We worked until noon in a beastly cold wind and under a dull sky, so that when we returned we were very fed up. There was great excitement during the afternoon. Saunders, the company sanitary man, digging in the yard behind the company's billet, struck a bottle of wine. Digging carefully, he unearthed a huge dump which provided the company with food for thought. Several bottles found their way into our mess, but of course we knew nothing about it officially. April 27th. Harding accompanied me today on the road mending party, and when we went on parade at 7 a.m. we had a terrible shock. There were numerous absentees and nearly everybody was tight. They were reeling about and laughing and presented such an extraordinary sight in two swaying lines that we hurried them off at once and marched unsteadily up the Doint road. They were immensely happy and greeted everyone we passed, including mules, with most amusing remarks. Corporal Mackay in particular kept me choking with laughter, for he was very tight indeed. He kept trying to shout the step and mixed up his lefts and rights indiscriminately. But he and all the others were very good-humoured and cheery. When we arrived at our working place, we spread them out along the road, then discreetly retired to the soberest part, where, seated on an old 15-inch gun barrel, out of the corners of our eyes we saw them one by one lie down, until only an occasional conscientious fellow remained shovelling stones into a shell hole. About half a dozen lads came up at odd times and asked if they could go home as they were feeling horribly ill. We let them go, and then I called up the sergeants and gave them a lecture, warning them to watch the troops more carefully in future. Luckily, no one came along to supervise the work, so when we marched the fairly sobered company back at midday, we said nothing to Ewing about it, though I had an idea that he knew. After dinner, a fellow from C Company named Samuel came in and asked me if I would go with him for a short leave in Paris. I had hardly spoken to him before, so I was highly flattered when he said he wanted someone who would be quiet and intelligent. I told him that I was going into Amiens next day with Thomas for a couple of days, but if he would put in an application, I would accompany him later. April 28th. At 7 a.m. Thomas called for me, and we tramped through the empty streets until we found the washing lorry which carried the division's shirts back to Amiens. It was too early for us to be cheerful, and we were fast asleep when he woke us outside the station in Amiens. We crossed the road to the Hôtel Beaufort, where we had a bath and a shave and booked a room. Then we wandered round the town, taking a swim at the baths and drinks at the American bars. After lunch at the Hôtel du Rhin, we floated along to my little flapper in the arcade, where we sat in armchairs with the gramophone playing, while she brought us souvenirs and trinkets to inspect. We bought some and wrote notes to our friends in England for her to enclose with them, then had a sticky tea in a little patisserie. Finished the evening by a visit to a divisional concert party and a stroll along the canal bank. April 29th, Sunday. Had breakfast in bed and, rising at midday, attended late mass in the cathedral. After lunch, made a tour of the town, eating ices in every café we could find. Also had luxurious haircuts and shampoos. We lunched at l'Univers and dined at the Hôtel de France. Bed at 1 a.m., April 30th. Caught a train at noon from Amiens to Corbie, where we had lunch at the club run by the Pretty Sisters. Then lounged about until 5 p.m. when we got onto a little light railway that had just been laid into Péronne. It moved very slowly and often stopped for long periods, so that as we crossed the old battlefields we were able to get out and look round the trenches and graves, now overgrown with grass and weeds. It was growing dusk, and I was moved to moralize over the pathetic aspect of the deserted trenches which had once been filled with life, and if dangerous had at least been cheery. It was dark when we reached Péronne, and leaving Thomas, I went on to our mess. I found everybody very amused by an incident of the morning. Yesterday a new major had joined the battalion. He was P.H., Whitehouse brother of Willie Whitehouse, who was sent home soon after I arrived. This one was not quite so objectionable, I was told, but being full of hot air, he had ordered a battalion parade for this morning. When he rode on parade, feeling a hell of a tit, his horse threw him, and he lay grovelling in the mud before the delighted troops. May 1st. This was a glorious day. We were working on the road by Courcelles again, so having drawn rations for the troops, Hammond and I marched them off in beautiful sunshine, tunics open and lively songs pouring out in chorus. We got them started, and then we wandered off to investigate a small house close by. It was a sad little place for, although all the furniture had gone, the floors were littered with kiddies' clothing, dolls and toys. There were lots of photographs of grannies, babies and rural weddings. All these had been cut across with knives, and all crockery was broken. We then went out again to the troops, and as all the shell holes were now filled, we started them digging channels to drain the water into the ditch. While they were doing this, Hammond and I played at being engineers, I building up a reservoir in a puddle, and he constructing an elaborate system of locks and channels and waterfalls to drain it off into a puddle of his own. We had just commenced to fight about it when Dunham came along with our lunch, 2 packets of sandwiches, a bottle of real English beer for me, and one of lemonade for Hammond, who was a TT, so we set off to find a nice place to eat it, while Private Mays, who had been watching our efforts with lofty displeasure, hurled reservoir, locks and all into the ditch with his mud shovel. A little further towards Péronne, we saw another larger house which we approached. It had evidently been a staff HQ, for the rooms on the ground floor had been cleaned and built up with 3 layers of large trees to make the cellar shell-proof. We decided to lunch there and passed the word along the troops to knock off. They were all very happy working in their shirt sleeves, singing gaily and chaffing each other, pouring sweat under the sun's hot rays. We sent Dunham across to the surly corporal's canteen for more chocolate. We went along to a veranda of coloured glass at the southern end of the house, intending to lunch there, but the rustling greenery of the garden called us, and we went back into the sunshine. The grass was long and rough, but in the still heat, with no sound but the faint rustle of the trees, it seemed very calm and peaceful. The tiny grass-grown pool was unruffled, and beside it, in the branches of a weeping willow, stood a statue of St. Anthony. Against a high red wall 30 yards away stood a greenhouse, with a little glass left, and inside a tangled mess of vines, tomatoes and weeds. At one end a dugout had been made. Lower down a tiny rustic bridge crossed a rapid brook on the banks of which stood a miniature rustic hut and occasional willow tree. Lying here on the soft grass we ate our lunch, basking in the hot rays of the sun and finding life sweet. Then, smoking and talking, we made brooches and bows out of sedge grass and tiny flowers. In order not to desecrate the happy little ruin, we buried our sandwich paper and replaced the turf, though there were dozens of empty tins lying round. Then we threw our empty bottles into the stream and raced beside them, each cheering his own craft TT versus Toper, until after about half a mile they were caught in the weeds, and we lay down and panted on the bank. Strolling quietly back in silence, we found a dead pigeon and buried him, railing in his grave with little sticks and chains of plaited sedge-grass, and in his coverlet of pimpernels we erected a tiny white cross. Then we went out onto the hot white road, where our troops lay under the hedge, some smoking, some asleep. Most of them had pulled bunches of may and dog roses, which bedecked their caps, and all were very lazy and happy when we went along to distribute the chocolate which Dunham had brought. Then we continued our work until 4 p.m, when we marched back feeling that life was worth living and war worth fighting. May 2nd. It was my turn off duty today, so I did not march out with the company. Nevertheless, I strolled down later to chat with Hammond and Radcliffe. There had been several changes during these few days. Colonel Hanson had returned, and Major Gell had returned to the 5th Battalion, thank God. Harper, the adjutant, had gone sick, and Mortimer had taken his place with Hoskins as assistant. Guthrie and several others had left. In fact, we had lost nearly all the fellows I most disliked. I was still working hard on the garden, and by now had it half cleared and much nicer to look at. The mess and whole house were spick and span, and we were more comfortable than anyone else in the town. May 3rd. A few days ago, the sentry on HQ did not salute the brigadier, so this morning the whole battalion had to parade for drill and guard duties. In the evening, we had a battalion dinner, all officers dining together at HQ. We sent up several of our servants to assist. The dinner was very loud. The food was excellent, and the champagne flowed very freely. Nearly everybody got tight, Thomas being the first to succumb. While the commanding officer was making a serious speech, recalling the history of the battalion and toasting the memory of the fellows who had gone west, Tommy burst into maniacal laughter and collapsed on the floor. He was swept up, and Radcliffe took the piano to accompany the various singers. After a long sing-song, a violent rag was started in which the enormous and disgusting Padre offered to fight 6 subalterns. He knocked them about for a long time before he was debagged and spanked. Coleridge and Scales had a serious fight, but neither was hurt, and they ended by kissing and crying over each other. May 4th. At 1 a.m. we broke up and returned to our messes, singing all the way in the moonlight. Pepper, Radcliffe and I went on to our favourite spot by the lock gates, where we sat and droned sad choruses for half an hour before retiring. As I went up to my room, I wondered if the servants were back, so climbed up to their quarters. Dunham and Martin were asleep, but Willis was sitting up, swearing gently at his puttees. He was very tight, and though quite respectful to us, he swore offensively at Marshall, who was not there. Going into Radcliffe's room, I whispered to him to come and help me find Marshall, a boy of 19, due for leave in a few days. Trekking back to HQ, we found him lying by the side of the road. I picked him up in my arms and started back. After a few moments, he woke up and started whimpering. I told him that he was all right, and recognizing my voice, he cried and begged me not to stop his leave. On the way back, I had to assure him repeatedly that I would forgive him and not have him court-martialed. While we were putting him to bed, Willis delivered a long, solemn and more or less incoherent harangue on the evils of drink, which was quite lost on Marshall, who was by now fast asleep again. May 5th. The battalion did no work today, so we spent our time bathing and fooling about in an old boat. I also did a lot of work in the garden, which was now nearly finished. During the afternoon, Marshall came out and stood silent and hesitating. As I took no notice of him, he started working beside me, then stood up and said, "Mr. Vaughan, give me a bit over the head with that shovel." "Sir?" I said, "Certainly, Marshall, if it will please you, but why?" "'Cause I'm ashamed of myself, sir. I ain't never been like that before, and my mother'd break her heart if she knew. It was the champagne what got me down. It's the first time I've had any." Then followed a long expression of penitence and thanks for my looking after him. which I terminated by repeating Willis's lecture on the evils of drink and gave him my pardon. May 6th, Sunday. Number work again today, so I finished off the garden. Really finished it. Every bit of rubbish burnt, paths swept, rose trees cleared and beds weeded. I was planting flowers scrounged from other gardens when Ewing came out, and I stood pointing at my handiwork with pride. He stood for a bit, sneering slightly, then said, "Well, Vaughan, you know it's labour in vain, don't you?" "Why?" I asked. "Because we're moving north tomorrow." And with that he left me. Gazing round at the result of my many hours of hard work, I felt inclined to cry, but I consoled myself with the thought that someone would get the benefit of them, and finishing the planting of the flowers, I called Hammond and set off to the YMCA to lay in stores, for heaven knew when we would again strike a canteen. Ewing was very fond of a new kind of lemon squash called Kia Ora, and when we had bought stacks of salmon, fruit biscuits, butter, prawns and other tinned stuff, plus much whiskey, I thought how nice and kind it would be to buy a case, convey it secretly, and enjoy his delight when it was produced at the other end. So we added on to the pile which the servants were coming to fetch. Returning to the mess, we set about the old game of sorting and discarding our property and packing mess boxes. The Harrison Fisher girls and many of the pretty plates I arranged to take with us. My British warm, French bayonet and souvenirs I packed up to send home. We all felt a great pang at the thought of leaving Péronne, for we looked upon it as our adopted town and had grown very fond of it, more practically because our friendship and own closer knowledge of the men had grown there. Going into the mess after lunch, I found Ewing looking at the canteen bill which the servants had brought in. He looked up at me with an angry red face. "Vaughan, you silly, senseless idiot! Why?" he choked. "Why will you be buying a case of Kia Ora when we're moving tomorrow? You fool! How the hell do you think you will carry it? Oh, I've no patience with you. You're past teaching." I was filled with disappointment at the misunderstanding, but managed to blurt out a few cuss words, telling him that I was mess president and not he, and could he mind his own bleeding business. A long quarrel followed in which he, being OC, got the better, and I retired into the kitchen to prepare what I intended to be the best dinner we had ever had. With my own hands, I did half the cooking and was very bucked with the results. At 7:30 p.m. I was slicing eggs for the hors d'oeuvres when Ewing's angry voice floated out asking why the hell dinner wasn't ready. So I wasn't able to make any mayonnaise. I served up an excellent 7-course dinner, but it was a dreary meal. Ewing was a bear, and we had hanging over us the depression caused by the knowledge that this was our last meal in the old town, and incidentally, the end of our rest. Radcliffe and I tried to keep things merry, but it finally devolved into a shop conversation regarding the possibilities of the future and our destination. May 7th. After a farewell look round the old billet and our happy playground at the lock gates, we fell in with the company and marched to the battalion parade ground on the road back to Sainte-Radegonde. In a few minutes at 7:30 a.m., we moved off and swung out of the town towards Bapaume, striking the cobbled Route Nationale at Mont-Saint-Quentin. It was a very hot march, the sun was glaring and the pace was fast. The troops, too, were out of practice, so that as I marched behind as second in command, I had a deuce of a job to prevent them straggling. When we reached Sailly-Saillisel, Ewing rode on ahead to see the adjutant, and I took charge of the company. As we were marching down a sunken road towards Morval, the halt signal was blown, and we fell out on the right of the road. The bank, however, was so steep that many of the troops could not get off the road, and when a few minutes later a cart came along, they had to climb up the bank on the left to allow it to pass. As they were thus scattered, a high-pitched voice came from behind the cart. "Where's the officer in charge of this party?" It was the brigadier riding with his staff, and I went forward and saluted. He was very peeved with us for being on the left of the road. It was damn bad discipline. He took my name and refused to hear my excuse, riding on to see the commanding officer. So I had to bow once more before injustice and rejoined my grinning troops, who were just falling in to resume the march. After a short time we entered Morval, where the head of the column halted by the broken wall. After a 10-minute standing halt, we were about turned and marched out of the village to a field where we formed up in close column, piled arms and fell out. We now learnt that we were to spend the night here. It was midday, and having sent the servants down to the road to fetch the mess boxes, we lay down to rest and await our lunch. To while away the time, I had another awful row with Ewing about the Kia Ora, which I had bribed the cooks to carry on the cooker. We had a cold lunch, and then Radcliffe and I went down to the village and wandered round the ruins. On our return, we proceeded to rig up bivouacs from oil sheets. We erected two, one for Harding, Radcliffe and me, and the other for Ewing and Hammond. Pepper had gone on to Fremicourt to take over our next billets. It was very difficult to fix a decent shelter with our scanty material, and we did not finish until nightfall. The troops did not worry to erect shelters, but lay on the grass wrapped in their oil sheets and coats. May 8th. We were all very wet when we woke, but soon dried as we breakfasted in bright sunshine. Then we packed our valises and mess boxes and sent them down to the dump on the road. An hour later, 10 a.m., we fell in and marched back to Saly-Salicelle, where we turned to the left up the Route Nationale, slogged on to Billancourt and thence to Fremicourt, which we reached at dusk. Having seen the troops into their huts and provided with a hot meal, we found our way to the empty huts allotted to us and dumped our packs on the ground. The servants went down to the cookers and got us some food which the troops had left, and this we ate, though it was quite cold. We played about a bit in the hut, but were fed up and went to bed early. May 9th. Depression was still upon us when we woke, and having dressed we set out sourly to visit the troops in their huts. Cheery as larks we found them, and 10 minutes of jollying with them raised our spirits, and we returned to eat a hearty breakfast, chattering like schoolgirls. Then we chased each other out again into the open to examine our surroundings. Our camp is just outside the village of Fremicourt, a heap of ruins, and around us stretch undulating grass plains, relieved only by shell holes, and, in the distance, the partly destroyed village of Bancourt. Finding that there were a few empty tents standing near the huts, we decided to take them and had our kit moved in. I am sharing one with Pepper, May 10th. Pepper went to Amiens on leave this morning, so Jimmy Harding moved into my tent for company. I walked over to the 7th Battalion this afternoon to see Fire Woodlock. He was away, and I stopped for a while with Jones, their colossal quartermaster, who is very proud of two fat lumbering puppies which have just arrived, Jumbo and Punch. We have a nondescript terrier on our headquarters staff called Idle. On my way back, I wandered off to a small clump of trees where were a number of graves Boche. Amongst them were the graves of 3 British airmen, each with a neat cross erected by the Germans giving details of their ages and regiments and date they were shot down. Their broken propellers were planted at their feet. After mess, Hammond and I walked through the gathering dusk to Bancourt, which looks very pretty from the distance, but is in ruins and overgrown with weeds. We wandered into a large garden, but were turned back by a sentry who had orders that no one was to approach a large ammunition dump therein. As we walked, we talked religion. Hammond, being a strict Low Church adherent, who admires Catholicism from a distance,